Welcome to Harmony Talk, a podcast about dreamers and doers. Hear people from all walks of life tell us about their dreams and the moment they knew there was no turning back as they went from dreaming to doing. This podcast is sponsored by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. My name is Greg Frigoletto, your host for this episode. For today's episode of Harmony Talk, I am delighted to have a conversation with Zachary Wahl Alexander. Zach is a full professor of sport pedagogy at Northern Illinois University. He also serves as the assistant director of Trails End Camp, having worked there over the past 14 summer camp seasons. Zach is also the co-founder and co-director of Project Flex, a physical activity and life skills program for incarcerated youth, which we will learn more about in this episode. Zach, welcome to Harmony Talk.
Good morning, and thanks for having me today.
No, it's our pleasure. I know, even from the intro, folks now already know that you are involved in the camp industry, and here we sit at the very end of a camp season, and if I'm not mistaken, there's just a few days to go, so I would imagine you're very busy as you're winding things down, so we really appreciate you squeezing some time in for us.
Of course, very busy is an understatement. We have 3 more days and about 300 male campers to pack before they go. But I'm excited to be here.
You know, we'll get to the camp part of your story in just a little bit, but if we could, to begin, this is a podcast that looks to inspire by sharing stories, Zach, like yours, that demonstrate that dreams can become a reality even when there are great obstacles to overcome. In other words, dreamers become doers, and that might be especially true when we talk a little bit later about Project Flex in regard to some of the folks that you work with at Project Flex. But with that in mind, the dreamers become doers part of what this podcast represents. We know that sometimes young people have dreams very early on in their life that later as adults come to fruition, and for others, the path sometimes takes a lot of turns, and the doing part might not fully align with what the dreaming part indicated. And we know some others are late bloomers. You know, let's start there for you. And I don't know which one of those applies best to you, but where did your dreams begin and how do they align with where you sit today?
So when I got my undergrad at University of Georgia and majored in physical and health education. And I ended up going to graduate school and got my master's and started a PhD at the University of Alabama. And during my last year at Alabama, I had the opportunity to teach physical and health education in a all-female juvenile detention center. And I taught there for about 9 months before becoming a professor at Northern Illinois, which is where I am now. And during that time, it was probably one of the most stressful periods of time in my life, just being in a maximum security prison every day. But it was also definitely the most rewarding. And I think for me, I sort of knew that I wanted to get back and work with that population one day. Didn't know how it would work or kind of like where the path would lead. But when I got to Northern Illinois, which is NIU, I was there for about 2 years and I met a colleague, Dr. Jen Jacob. She's a sports psychologist. And she also had a passion for working with underprivileged populations. And so one day we were kind of talking through some potential opportunities. And I just went to her. I was like, hey, I think we should do a prison program. And that was 8 years ago. I ended up cold calling one of the local juvenile detention centers, which is about 30 minutes from NIU. And I called them and they liked the idea. And about 8 months later, we were starting our first program. So I think I'm probably in the lucky pile in terms of not having to wait too long for the dream to come to fruition. But it was definitely a windy road for sure.
So when you were a young boy, you're growing up, was education on your mind early on, or did that come later? Were there different thoughts you had, or how did you land on that from the beginning?
Yeah, my mom was a special education teacher. So I just grew up being in schools and around schools. And I also played sports all my life. And when I went to college, my mom always told me, you should study the things that you enjoy most and that you like the most. And so I went in business and pre-law, and I had about 10 different majors. I probably picked every major that you can have before stumbling into the kinesiology, which is kind of the teacher training piece. And I did it and I liked it. And I was like, this makes sense. Like this works. And so I graduated with that and then knew that I wanted to, because I love school. I love being in school and learning. So when I started my master's, because I really like to write as well, I realized there was a way to kind of dovetail teaching and impacting youth, but then also the research end of it and the writing end of it. So the professor career path, aligns nicely with what my interests are and what I enjoy doing.
When you went through that version of your path, you talked a little bit about some of the things you had as interests, and one of them you mentioned was athletics. Did athletics play a big role in your life growing up?
Yeah, so I played baseball my whole life. So, we mentioned that I'm currently at a summer camp, and growing up in Long Island, a lot of my friends went to sleepaway camps. But, I played baseball, was never kind of afforded that opportunity as a kid. But the best thing about sport is that it teaches you all these life lessons that, you can attribute to your everyday existence, but you learn them kind of like in sport, like resiliency, like working through things. What you do off the field impacts the performance on the field. And those are all things that hold true regardless of the occupation that you have. But I think sports does a really great job of teaching those really soft skills. It does it in a way, it teaches you earlier for people that, were lucky enough to be involved in sports. So it's things that not only was I lucky enough to learn those lessons as a younger person, but also we hold those ideologies in our prison program that we currently facilitate. It's trying to teach those life lessons, those life skills through sport, as opposed to getting in front of a room and lecturing somebody about communication or resiliency and those types of things.
As you know from previous conversation we've had, I have an education background, and I've often thought that the greatest lessons aren't necessarily content driven. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But before we get into Project Flex, I want to ask you, so as you were pursuing your health and fitness teaching certification, you kind of said you stumbled on an opportunity at a maximum security prison. And why did that seem appealing at the time? And why did you go down that path?
I had a graduate assistantship at the University of Alabama. So essentially, they were paying for my graduate school and I was getting a small stipend. And for the 4 years prior, I was teaching college classes, and that was sort of like my responsibility. And then the last year, this was an opportunity that came up, and I thought that it was probably a once in a lifetime opportunity in terms of, how often do you get to teach in that setting? And I thought it would set me apart for my resume. And that year I was going to be applying for jobs, and I thought that would be just a really interesting niche notch in my belt that other people wouldn't have. And I figured it would just be for 1 year and I would never do it again. Little did I know, I spend about 15 to 20 hours a week in prisons right now. But that's sort of how that opportunity sort of played out.
And you also mentioned that, and I would fully agree that in the world of education, I've often said that every day that you go to work, you have an opportunity to change lives. Literally every day that you show up, you should view it as an opportunity that today I have this opportunity to change lives. And you referred to it a little earlier as, an impact that you could make every day. And as I was thinking about the different components of your story, teacher, educator, professor, camp director, your program Project Flex, which I want to dig into in just a moment, deals specifically with incarcerated youth. And I think if you look at each of those different roles that you play, there's probably, even though they seem like very different worlds, there's great similarities. And for me, the one word that kept coming to mind when I was thinking about kind of the crosswalk between them is that each of them individually can be transformational. Maybe talk a little bit about each role that you play. You're a professor, you're a camp director, and this Project Flex program that you implement. How does transformational play into each of those? And is there an analogy, a crosswalk that you could make?
I would agree with that. I think kind of across all three, and I can kind of speak to them individually, but across all three, and this is just life in general, it's all about relationships and the relationships that you forge with people. So in my professional life as a professor, I train future teachers. One of the reasons why I went into that profession was as a high school teacher, you might have 100 students a year, 115, 120 students a year, and you can have a really big impact on those 120 a year. But as a professor, I might have 20 to 30 kids in a class. And the hope is that my philosophies and my values kind of get instilled in them. And then they would have that impact on their 120, 150 a year. And just the impact is exponentially more, it's just greater at that point. But in terms of whether it's in the camp setting or whether it's in as a professor, I think it's building relationships with people so that they understand like the impact that they can have on others. Because a lot of the times, as a high school teacher, whether you're teaching math or science or reading, or if you're teaching, health and fitness or sport, the core content that they're teaching is secondary. It's like more peripheral to being that positive role model. You know what I mean? Like 15, 20 years from now, the students that I have or that they have are not going to remember the content, but they're going to remember like how you made them feel and the impact that you had on them in terms of like how you helped develop them as a person. And so that holds true, I think, in education and at camp. I think actually just recently we had, for those of you that are listening that have been to camp, we just had our color war or our Olympics. And one of the biggest honors that we have here is we give counselors an opportunity to be notified or awarded as Olympic captains. So that's a big honor that we have. And someone, literally, this was last week, who was an Olympic captain. He grew up in camp. I've known him since he was 9 years old. And after the fact, he told me, he's like, without you, like I wouldn't be here, because he had a really tough transition into camp. The first 2 years was really tricky for him. And I was definitely a sounding board for him and a support system for him. And without me, he said that he wouldn't be where he is right now. And so just hearing that and hearing the impact that you can have. And I think just as educators, whether it's in K through 12 setting or here, people don't realize the impact, the positive impact that you have on people, even without knowing it sometimes. Because again, like I knew that he had a tough time. I didn't realize how, important my role in his life had on him. And so sometimes you just don't realize the impact that you playing in people's lives.
I often refer to that, Zach, as everybody goes to sleep at night, and everybody, when they go to sleep at night, they put their head on their pillow, and most people reflect on their day and the opportunity that you have in the roles you play, or as an educator for anybody. The role you can play is that those thoughts, that reflection that individual's taking part in as they're going to sleep might include you having played a really positive role in their day, and how powerful that could be. I'm not a camp guy. I never attended camp, and I could tell you that I'm enamored by some of what I see through the camp industry. But one of the things I know is true is that oftentimes campers show up at the beginning of a camp season and they're emotional about leaving home and maybe having to attend. But on the back end of that, and this is going to be happening probably a lot on Friday, your last day this camp season, you're going to have a lot of kids super emotional, probably a lot of tears because they have to leave, and I would imagine a lot of what you were saying just a moment ago about the relationships, that is such a critical piece of what I'm sure the success of a camp is, much like it is in the classroom. And there is a great crosswalk there. The crosswalk, though, between the camp world and Project Flex and the demographic, there couldn't be, I think, two more polar opposite demographics, right? So you have the camp industry, who probably are a far stretch from the incarcerated youth that you're dealing with. Talk to us a little bit, if you could, as we kind of dive into Project Flex, about what the incarcerated youth demographic kind of represents. What actually are the types of individuals that you're targeting with your program?
Yeah, so we are in the state of Illinois. And so just to talk a little bit about the state of Illinois in terms of incarcerated youth, there's 5 juvenile detention centers across the state. There are 3 which are in about a 1-hour radius of NIU's campus, and we run programming in all 3 of them. And then there are 2 others that are downstate. So one's about 3 hours away, one's about 5 hours away, and we're starting programming at both of those in this calendar year. So we're starting in October and December. What the population looks like, I'd say about 65 to 70% are, at some of the facilities at least, are in for murder. So they have extended sentences. And the demographics are, most of them are Black. There's definitely a good portion of the population that's Hispanic, but they're coming from some of the tougher, low SES areas throughout the state. So a large proportion of them, a percentage of them are coming from downtown Chicago. A lot of them are coming from Rockford. There's some from Springfield. There's some from Champaign's. So they're coming from some of the tougher areas. Almost all, if not all of them, are involved in gang activity, and you have gang affiliations. I'm from Long Island, and what I thought poverty was is not even close to what poverty actually is. A lot of these kids don't have running water in their house. A lot of them don't have electricity in their house. So it's definitely a different portion of the world that we're working with, but people are people when they're stripped down. And that's the nice thing about camp and also jail, is that they're stripped down to themselves, and there are a lot of similarities in personalities and actions of, the kids that I work with that are in prison also at camp. But just at the end of the day, they're just people. A lot of them had really crappy circumstances that played a role in making them make some choices that they really didn't have a choice to make.
As they come there, and this is no pun intended, they come from very diverse backgrounds. They come from a demographic on a social, economic basis that's probably pretty bleak. But you do have, again, no pun intended, a captive audience. With that group and with Project Flex, what are the goals? So if you could tell us a little bit about specifically, what are you trying to accomplish with the individuals that you're dealing with, and what are the methods you're using to reach those goals?
We have a lot of different programs that we have. Our base level program, which is in all those facilities that I discussed earlier, and we work with probably 90% of the population in these facilities. It's what we call like a flex session, which is a combination of either a team sport and an individual sport. And what we do is we try to instill and integrate different life skills into everyday programming. So a common theme for the week might be resiliency. And we would define resiliency for them in a way that they can ingest it, not in a way that like a white person would, or like, a textbook would say, and try to relate it to their life. And then what we try to do is set up different team building activities or stop activities that we're doing when someone has shown resiliency, like within the sport or the activity. And then at the end of our daily program, we kind of talk through it again. We have kids give examples, and then we try to, and the goal of these life skills is to transfer it outside of the program. So how can you use resiliency in your day-to-day life here in jail? And how can you potentially use resiliency when you get out 6 months from now, 6 years from now? And so trying to teach the skills in a way that they understand it, but then also get them to transfer these skills. That's kind of one of our main goals. We also have done, as we've expanded, we've had a couple of different offshoot programs. So one of the main goals of Project Flex is to have the kids, once they leave, not come back, obviously, right? Like that's the whole reason that we incarcerate. And so one of the things that keeps people coming back to jail is their circumstances when they leave are the same as when they got to jail. So we have a college educational leadership program. And essentially what we do is we provide opportunities for youth from the facilities to come to NIU's campus and experience a day in the life of a college student. So they'll come to class, we'll meet with academic advisors, we'll sit in college classes, we'll take a tour of the dorms, we'll eat in the dining hall, we'll go to the rec center, and literally just give them a day of college. And for almost all of them, they've never stepped foot in a college campus before. And the research will show that just stepping foot on a college campus exponentially increases the likelihood that they will attend college one day. And so, for us, the goal is maybe not getting them to college, but it's exposing them to college and saying like, hey, like this is for you, and demonstrating to them that they're no different than the students that are at NIU or any of these other colleges. We also, because college isn't for everybody, we have a program that's called PT for Life. It's a personal training certifying program. And what we do is it's a 4-month program. Youth go in cohorts of 3 or 4, and it culminates with them sitting for their personal training certification exam, which is a 200-question test. And kind of like built into this 4-month program, we teach them the content knowledge that they need to be successful. We teach them like the pedagogy, so like how to teach fitness. We also do a lot of professional development. So we work on interviewing skills. We work on cover letters, resume building. And so the goal is once they leave the facility, they have this core set of skills where they can go and become a personal trainer. And we have a partnership with ISSA, which is one of the largest world certifiers of personal training online. They've teamed with us to help the youth that graduate get placed with jobs. So again, it's just like finding ways to alter their existence post-incarceration to keep them from coming back.
Yeah, as I was hearing you go through that and also looking at, some of the information I found on your website, obviously the goal would have to be to improve recidivism, because chances are they'll be back. But what you're trying to do, which I'm thrilled to hear and think you guys are doing a great job with it, is more than just that. It's about having them leave with improved life skills, but also truly an opportunity to have a transitional plan. That's kind of what you're talking about there. Now, interestingly enough, when I was looking at the website, I would imagine the demographic that you have, the students you work with, they tell you what's on their mind and they probably don't sugarcoat anything, right? So, if you ask them what their thoughts are, you're going to be careful what you ask for. But what I did notice on your website was that you provided some testimonials. And, And as I was reading through them, I think these testimonials are probably pretty consistent across hopefully a lot of the individuals you work with. But the ones in particular that I noted, I think are pretty profound and speak well to the mission that you guys have at Project Flex and how you might actually be accomplishing the goals. And just to give you an example of a few of them, one of them said, they don't want us to go down the same paths that we was going down. And another one says, one of the reasons we're able to get so close to the Flex people is because they come in and they don't push themselves on us. If you want to sit there on the corner and just watch, they're going to let you sit there on the corner and just watch. They respect that. They hope that you'll join, but if you don't, they respect it. They're not going to push nothing on you. And I thought that one, when I read it, was really profound because my hunch is that there's a big trust issue for the individuals that come in there. And maybe if you could, with that in particular testimonial, speak to me about what that observation is by that student and how it relates to trust and how you guide yourself and your staff through that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's a couple of parts to that. I think kind of like on the smaller scale, there's not a lot of people that from the outside that go into prison. So not a lot of volunteers. There's some programming, but oftentimes it's not super consistent. And what we do is we try to provide consistency, like not just with Project Flex. And we have programming across these facilities 3 to 4 days a week. So they're seeing someone or multiple people from Project Flex, almost every day. But it's the same people are going to be with them for at least 1 year, sometimes 2, sometimes longer. Because just like anywhere else, relationship building, it's a skill, but it also takes time. And the more time you spend with somebody, the better the relationship is going to be. So I think that's part of it. The other part of it, and this directly relates back to that quote, is that you have to kind of meet people where they are. And certain people are more extroverted. They're going to come up to you, like whether you're in a prison or whether you're in a restaurant or a bar. Some people are more introverted and it's going to take them more time. They need to feel trust and they need to feel that this person might be in their life for a longer period of time. Because unfortunately, a lot of these kids do not have consistency with adults and they don't have a lot of positive role models with adults. And they think that like if someone comes in that they don't know, this person's not going to be here in a week. Like, why should I take the time to get to know them? And so we try to teach our graduate students. We have a pretty long training prior to going into facilities. And a lot of it is based on relationship building and meeting people where they are. And if someone needs time, whether that's a week, whether that's a month, or whether that's years, letting them, like Project Flex, like we don't allow gang affiliation stuff. We don't allow them to do gang handshakes or do any of the like language. It is a safe space for them. And if that means sitting on the side and watching until they become comfortable and want to engage, like that's totally fine. That is one of the kind of the key tenets is it is a safe space for everybody. In prison land, there's a lot of fights and a lot of things that go on. And in 8 years across 3 facilities, I think we've had 2 fights and both of them were before programming even started. It wasn't even during programming. So, it is a safe environment, which is very rare. And I think it's creating that climate and building the relationships between our staff, so our graduate students and the youth that are there is probably what has led to us being so successful.
One of the things that I think would be important for you to share with us is that obviously, with the role you're playing in the prisons that you're participating with, funding is needed. And with funding, it's not just handed out, and affiliations that you have with the university wouldn't let this continue unless certain things could be demonstrated. So for our listeners who might think, boy, this just sounds like a glorified phys ed opportunity in a prison, I think they would be really mistaken. And if you could demonstrate why that is and how the data and the statistics and the research plays an integral role in this. It's much more than it might appear on the surface. It's not strictly just about building relationships. That's critical, but it's more than that. Could you explain a little of that, please?
For those kind of contrarians, I think relationships kind of fuel everything. So whether you're in a school, and right now in the K through 12 setting, SEL, so social emotional learning, is such a push in schools throughout the country. And the content could be great that they want to be taught, the SEL content. But if the teachers don't have relationships with the students, doesn't matter how good the content is, the students aren't going to listen to the teachers and they're not going to retain the information. So at the kind of the crux of what we do, we have to build relationships for them to fully grasp and fully comprehend and take on like what we're teaching them. In terms of data, so we do collect a lot of data, and I think there's different ideologies on what people think are important. So across all of our programs, for the ones that have participate in not only our normal Flex sessions, but in our like leadership program, our recidivism rate is quite low, and it's lower than the average the kind of the 3 and 5 year average that they have across Illinois. So basically, the ones that are working with us the most are a higher likelihood that they're going to stay out of jail. And obviously, there's funding and money that goes into programming, but there's also a lot of funding and money that goes into incarcerating youth and adults. In terms of kind of the physical, like the fitness side, as you can imagine, just typical high school or middle school to high school age male is going to slowly increase their weight, and their body mass index is going to essentially stay the same with a very, very slight incline. Incarcerated youth or incarcerated males at the same age, upon incarceration, they're going to increase their weight significantly more than the average middle school, high school person. People, the youth that have gone on and participate regularly in our programming, their weight gain is about the same as your typical middle school and high school student, which is great. But also BMI is going to stay stationary as well. So basically, with our programming, we're able to curb kind of the weight gain and the obesity epidemic in facilities, right? There's more to it than that, but we've shown that the impact on their health and wellness. The other piece, and these are just more like fitness things that I think the everyday listener would kind of grasp is, a lot of people, they have their Fitbit or their Apple Watch and they're looking at how physically active they are or how many steps they get in a day. And the CDC recommends 17 to 25-year-old and above to get about anywhere from 10,000 to 12,000 steps a day. And that's going to have a positive impact on your long-term health. And the research, not within our prisons, but the nationwide average of steps a day is right around 3,500 steps a day. We have done research looking at how physically active youth are within our program. And we have shown an average of about 5,500 steps in an hour of programming. So we're essentially getting about 50% of the recommended daily steps within an hour of programming. And we're able to get that for all of the youth, multiple times a week. So we're having a pretty significant impact on the physical and health of youth that we work with. I think that the underpinning of what we do, it's the impact and providing these youth with a positive role model and people that they can count on is significantly more impactful than the health and fitness measures and outcomes that we've been able to hit.
I wanted to ask you too, with the role you're playing in the prison and the individuals that are involved, I would imagine based on the relationships that are being built and the activities that they're partaking in, and maybe even their own recognition of the positive influence it's having on them while they're involved in it. Does their behavior and their time being incarcerated outside of when they're directly involved with Project Flex, could their behavior compromise their being able to be involved? Is Project Flex something that has to be earned and maintained? So in other words, what I'm thinking might be happening is that Project Flex probably transcends beyond individuals. It probably creates a better climate and environment in the entire facility. Is that true? And do you see that happening?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually had a PhD student that just graduated, and she did one of her dissertation studies looking at the global impact of Project Flex on the facilities. And two of the things she found is that it had an impact on the staff in terms of their morale because they're engaged in programming with the youth, and just having those positive interactions led to more positive interactions back on their, what they call on their unit. It also demonstrated, we've looked at the amount of tickets, which is essentially like behavioral things that they're not supposed to be doing that they do. And on days that we have programming, it's less, but also there's been a pretty strong decline trend in terms of the amount of tickets since we started to before, which again, it could be attributed to a lot of things, but a lot of it is there is a certain standard that we have where our programming is open to all youth, but if they get into a physical altercation, they're not allowed to come back for a couple of weeks. This is all anecdotal, but youth will say that they made choices based on not wanting to miss certain things or not wanting to let people down. And that is rare to hear in a K through 12 setting, but it's significantly more rare to hear in a prison setting. And so again, it's all anecdotal, but we're in these facilities and interacting with these youth all the time. And you can see change in the youth based on the principles that we're teaching them. And it's really great to see, even though sometimes they won't share that with you. When you see them change and you can see their behaviors and their attitudes change towards different things within programming, but then also outside, that you're having an impact.
Yeah, and that's kind of going back to what I was talking about earlier, that whole notion of transformational. If we could go back to the beginning, you mentioned a little bit of a story as you're ending this camp season of a young camper who, through the experiences, kind of claimed that the difference you made was so impactful that he's a different person. And that's a great story that demonstrates probably what a lot of the campers feel as they're leaving. So if you could use the term anecdotally just a moment ago, like either anecdotally or maybe a real story, if you were to want to tell our audience of what would be a full demonstration from an individual as they leave being incarcerated and having participated in Project Flex, what would be something that you would say would demonstrate to you, okay, mission accomplished?
I'll give you two quick ones. I think the first is the first youth that had gone through our personal training certification program. We're able to get phone numbers and connect with kids or the youth once they leave. So a person that I got particularly close with that I was trying to get a job, I was texting with him almost every single day and making sure, like, just giving him little like affirmations and making sure he was doing the right thing. And again, this is a 19-year-old kid that lives in the south side of Chicago, and he's texting with a 38-year-old white man at 10 o'clock on a Friday, and like knowing that like he might make a choice on a Friday night. And so that would be something that he was making good choices. And that's something that I think if the relationship wasn't there, he would just wait to text me back and at another time or ignore it. I think the other piece, and this is sort of one of the other quotes that I think is one of the more impactful ones that we had during one of our campus visits. We do like a debrief at the end of the day for the youth to talk through the experience and to, just kind of share like where they are and what was the impact of the day on them. And one of our favorite quotes that we've had is that, and he said, "It's crazy that I had to go to jail to get an experience like this." And so the impact of like what he's exposed to, and he had to go to prison to get a positive experience like that, it just shows in terms of like transformational, the impact that our program can have on these youth because they just have never been afforded opportunities like this before.
Yeah, you talked earlier about the part of your program where you're exposing kids to the university for a day, and it's about exposure. And that quote from that individual, it is unfortunate that the exposure they had to have to a relationship like you guys are providing had to come by way of being incarcerated. Now, as we start to wind it down here, what's next for Project Flex?
So to finish up this calendar year, we're starting to integrate our programming in 2 more facilities. So starting in October and then I think in December. So at that point, we'll be in all 5 of the juvenile detention centers across Illinois. And then we're also starting programming in one of the adult facilities in downtown Chicago. And we're going to integrate our personal training certification program there. So that is sort of kind of like locally what's next. We've had some conversations with some of the neighboring states about wanting to integrate similar programming in their states. So we're sort of slowly in talks with them to see kind of like what's next. But one of our guiding principles is we want to walk before we run. So we want to make sure everything that we're doing, we have a very high standard for the work that we do and the programming that we do. So we don't want to expand too fast, or we don't want to do something that might compromise the impact that we're having on the youth that we're currently working with. So we're sort of just continuing to improve the quality of programming that we're in, provide new offerings, and then see if we can touch the lives of more kids.
Well, speaking of the impact you're making on the youth, clearly I think you are, and I congratulate you and compliment you on the work you're doing.
Thank you.
I've been talking with Zachary Wahl Alexander, professor of sport pedagogy at Northern Illinois University, assistant director at Trails End Camp in Beach Lake, Pennsylvania, and co-founder and co-director of Project Flex. This has been Harmony Talk by A.M. Skyer, a third-generation family insurance business started in 1920. I'm Greg Frigoletto. Thank you to Zach for being with us today. Learn more about Project Flex on their website at projectflex.org, at LinkedIn at Project Flex, and on Instagram at NIU Project Flex. To our listeners, continue to dream and keep doing.